Hello, good evening, everyone. Welcome to our guests here and also all of you scattered throughout the world watching via various digital platforms as we celebrate the 2022 Art, Culture and Technology public lecture of Nida Sinnokrot as a part of Department of Architecture Spring Lecture Series. My name is Azrak Shamia. I'm an artist and director of the Art, Culture, Technology program. And I would like to begin this evening with a land acknowledgement statement. MIT acknowledges indigenous peoples as the traditional stewards of the land and the enduring relationship that exists between them and their traditional territories. The land on which we sit is the traditional unceded territory of the Wampanoag Nation. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide and the forced occupation of the territory, and we honor and respect the many diverse indigenous people connected to this land on which we gather from time immemorial. It's my great pleasure to welcome and introduce Nida Sinnokrot, a colleague at Art Culture Technology program. He's an artist and educator whose work explores how various forms of power and bias are embedded in dominant narrative structures and attendant articulations of time and space. He practices in a range of media, including film, video photography, sculpture, installation, and agriculture. His work seeks to expose various technologies of control that give rise to shifting social, political, and environmental instabilities. Nida is an assistant professor in Art, Culture, and Technology program. He's also a co-founder of Sakia, Art, Science, Agriculture, an international residency program and a research platform located in the West Bank in Palestine in the village of Ein Kinia. Nida received his BA from the University of Texas at Austin and an MFA from Bard College. In 2001, he participated at the Whitney Museum of American Art Independent Study Program. He's also a Rockefeller Foundation Media Arts Fellow and a Fellow of Académie Schloss Solitude. He has received support from the Metz Academy, Paul Robinson Fund, and Catan Foundation, among many others. His recent solo shows include Kunststation St. Peter in Cologne, Expand, Extract, Repent, Repeat at the Carlier Gebauer Gallery in Berlin, and Exquisite Rotation at the Kiosk Gallery in Ghent. His work and this range of exhibition is just really fantastic. Has been featured in various international exhibitions and biennials, including Sharjah Biennale 9 and 13, Taipei Biennial in Taiwan, Witte de Wit Center for Contemporary Art in Rotterdam, Mathaf Arab Museum of Modern Art in Doha, Institut de Monde Arabe in Paris, Institut Valencia de Modern Art in Spain, Staatliches Museum Ägyptischer Kunst in Munich, Biennale Cuvée in Linz, Austria, Palais Beaux-Arts in Brussels, Amamal Foundation in Jerusalem, Artist Space in New York, and also the first museum exhibition in the United States devoted to the contemporary art of Palestine called Made in Palestine at the Station Museum in Houston, Some Arts Cultural Center San Francisco, and the Wood Gallery and the Art Center in Montpellier, and the Bridge in New York. Nida's first feature film, Palestine Blues, a documentary on Palestinian farmers' struggles of a disappearing landscape, screened in over 30 festivals worldwide and won 7 awards for Best Documentary. Nida's work has been acquired by various published collections, including the Sharjah Art Foundation in the Emirates, Khalid Shoman Foundation in Amman, Jordan, the Palestinian Museum in Birzeit, Palestine, and Adrastus Collection in Arevalo, Spain. And now, without further ado, please help me in welcoming Nida Sinnokrot.
Thank you, Ezra. That's very kind. And thanks to the School of Architecture and to ACT and to all of you for sharing your precious time with us. I know it's the end of the semester. Hi. But like, as Ezra mentioned, hacking technologies and infrastructures of control that give rise to social, political, and environmental instabilities has always been a driving force in my practice. And it was while making Palestine Blues, this documentary about a farmer-led nonviolent resistance movement against the Israeli annexation of their natural resources, that the seed for Ka, a piece I made out of a bulldozer, possessed me.
عربي تفهم عربي وقتش بدهم يصوروا العراق العراق وقتش بدهم يصوروها العراق وقتش بدهم يدقوها
هذه المنطقة اللي ماتت فيها ريتشا هذه النتفة ضمن دهاسها الجراف فيها
So I already had this in the back of my mind when Jack Persekian and Isabel Carlos invited me to participate in the Sharjah Biennial 9. And in the context of the Gulf states' building boom and immigrant labor abuse, I immediately recalled a small gold sculpture I had seen in the Egyptian Museum in Cairo, not the new one, the old one. Its two joined headless arms reaching upwards, known as Ka. The sculpture was on a landing leading to the mummy room, and at the base of the stairs, you had to surrender your photographic equipment to a guard. Years later, a friend of mine sent me these 5 blurry images and a note of apology that he was busted on the first time. I was living in Spain at that time. It just so happens that one of the world's largest international boneyards, essentially a resting place for land-moving machinery, is in Benavente, not too far from Madrid. Walking through endless rows of these twisted iron dinosaurs, you can't help but think of a mausoleum to modernity as natural history museum. It's kind of like the Egyptian museum in the sense that nothing's organized. You can turn a corner and feel like no one's been there for years. It's an amazing place. On my 3rd day there, I found 2 small old backhoes with a young tree sprouting up through the driver's seat of one of them. And I immediately knew that those were the implements, those were the ones I wanted to use. But at that point, I was still considering its form, especially its surface, experimenting with gold leaf, and even a version of it where the arms are attached to a plinth, a hydraulic plinth, and they shake in exhaustion and struggle to stay upright, and finally collapse when you walk away. But the nightmares about bulldozers I was having were getting worse until I realized that those initial responses were too much guided by a reflex to avoid ambiguity, to more precisely politicize. That morning I imagined it as a symbol of atonement, a refusal to dig. And when I embraced that simple gesture, I was able to read the plurality of affects and significations in it. The politics and critique are all there in that simple clash between techne and primal gesture, between sacred and profane. And that's something we're reckoning with today, globally, in every aspect of human existence. In shipping terms, backhoe arms fall under the category of tools, so they can travel loose on deck without a crate, without the kind of care, insurance, and cost associated with typically sending an artwork. In fact, it's much cheaper to send these tools than to send a painting. But the risks meant parts of it didn't arrive. It was important that the pieces function, that they have their potential energy and not simply welded into shape. So I took it to a repair shop in the desert outside of Sharjah for restoration. I worked with Mohadeen, Sharma, Hassan, and Ali for the next 4 days fabricating the missing parts. They loved the project, and during tea breaks we talked politics, the failing economy, and how we missed our families and hometowns, the war on Gaza that was happening at the time, and the pharaonic origins of Ka. Heavy machinery is every day for these guys. Nothing unusual about backhoes, bulldozers, or digging. But as these pieces transformed into Ka JCB, as they named it, they observed how context is everything. The work found its spirit in that workshop, in that labor camp, working together. In 2012, I was invited to make a Ka for Shukun Ahna, the first international contemporary art exhibition in the National Museum of Carthage, curated by Timo Kabalinke and Khadija Hamdi. Shukun Ahna means, who are we? But for a number of reasons, we weren't able to get permission to install it upright. And so Ka Carthage lay flat on the ground, like a sleeping giant, exhausted, on the cusp of the Jasmine Revolution. It wasn't until 2018 when Rim Fadda invited me to participate in Jerusalem Lives, the inaugural exhibition at the Palestinian Museum. That's when I was finally able to realize the Ka I had always imagined for Palestine, using the 1993 model of the JCB 3CX. Important because 1993 was the year of Oslo. I had already been collecting the parts across the West Bank for some time, and thanks to Athman Samara, his father and brothers, we began the performance of its restoration. Ka Oslo is 3 times the size and weight of JCB, and this posed some interesting engineering challenges. It's massive. When you're looking at it, it somehow feels light, and I think that's because it's uplifting, but it's really rather intimidating. And I had to make it safe. Of course, it had to withstand hurricane-force winds, and I didn't want it to have a monolithic plinth. I didn't want anything to interrupt the circuits of meaning between the implements and the ground. And so this took a lot of convincing, because we had to essentially dig up a section of the brand new courtyard of the brand new Palestinian Museum to do that. We spent weeks working on it, but when I invited them to the opening, their immediate reaction, when I invited Othman and his family to the opening, the reaction was, that's not a place for us. The museum is not a place for us. And that goes back to the question of Carthage. Who are we? And more specifically, what do we want? What future are we building? Since the signing of the Oslo Accords in 1993, I've seen a rise of debt culture, mortgages, neoliberal policies, NGOization, radicalization, violence, and the trivialization of indigenous, agrarian, social, and spiritual practices connected to land. And our cultural institutions at large struggle to address this divide. The ancient Egyptian Ka concept has numerous interpretations, from the life force of all things, to the promise of return or resurrection, to letting go or departure, to a moral code for submission and power, to Ka as self, as double, as representation. And riffing off this semiotic web, Ka Oslo can be read on a horizontal axis, above ground and below ground, as refusal, defiance, supplication, prayer, begging the heavens while questioning their earthly purpose. And around a vertical axis, between the arms, with the implements pointing towards mimetic desire and conflict. Colonized and colonizer. And in this sense, we see Israeli and Palestinian leadership imitating each other's desires, nationalist aspirations, modernist notions of taming the wild, scapegoating, and silencing dissent in the name of order and security. But in order to be truly free, truly liberated, we have to stop seeing ourselves in this drama of reciprocal imitation. The technologies and mythologies we use to maintain colonial narratives of progress, extraction, liberation are not neutral. If we think about techniques as power, and as a power that inherently distorts and exploits nature, these implements, the hands, the arms, the base, give expression to a complicated matrix of power and violence we see happening in Palestine today. And so if we're to build for equal rights and justice, we need sustainable technologies and mythologies that embrace collective practices and dismantle the visible and hidden infrastructures of occupation that govern our lives. And that's the work of art. In the tattered, scarred, refinished, inscribed, and tattooed surface of these tools, perhaps we can reconsider territories, imagine new ways of mapping, and invent new implements that embrace ambiguity and a plurality of weights and measures that challenge our false idols of permanence, power, nation states, and the infrastructures we build in their service. But to do that, we have to listen. Perhaps cause potential, that life force resonates between its hands, between transmission and reception. In that sense, it's an antenna, a tuning fork to a forgotten frequency. My friend Kenny Strickland once described Ka JCB as plowshares into prayers. I think Ka Oslo is calling us to heal the rift between culture and nature, between art and agriculture, as an antidote to the increasingly hostile and alienating stage of late capitalism we are living through today. In the end, Othman and his family came to the opening, and it's that gesture that defines the potential of what we can become and the kind of infrastructures we might build. While we're on the subject of land-moving machinery, I'd like to share a story I came across a few years ago as a result of the brilliant research and writing of Samuel Dolby and Shay Haskiny. Abu Ibrahim, this is not Abu Ibrahim, this is a street vendor carrying the most popular newspaper at the time. This is around 1911. It's called Philistine, Palestine newspaper. So Abu Ibrahim was a Palestinian peasant, or a fallah, who wrote a column called in the Peasant Letters, in the Philistine newspaper from the period of 1911-1912. In these columns, he made an impassioned argument that in order to modernize, in order to be secure, Palestinian peasants needed to abandon the practice of collective land tenure, known as Masha. Masha refers to a land classification system that's very nuanced and sophisticated, but also more specifically to the practice, the communal and collective practice of tending to these lands. So that in order to become modern and secure, they had to abandon the Masha and invest in modern infrastructures and technologies. Abu Ibrahim argued that the Masha hindered progress and that by investing in modern agricultural techniques, Palestinian peasants could become competitive and enter a surplus rather than sustenance economy. However, the way Masha worked was that you did not own your land. The land rotated between families seasonally. So why would one family invest in heavy machinery if the next season someone else would be tending the land? Abu Ibrahim was in fact a pseudonym for a fictional character created by Isa al-Isa on the left, the founder and co-editor of Philistine newspaper, and Menashe Mirovich, an agronomist who immigrated from the Russian Empire to Palestine in 1883 to help establish one of the first Zionist colonies, Rishon LeZion. What's most fascinating is how a shared vision of modernization and progress and control over nature for the sake of economic development and entree into European markets brought these two men together. So just so you know where we're going, a little bit of a background. So the loss of Masha began in 1858 during the Ottoman Empire with the passing of a land law that introduced the concept of land as property. It could be parceled, mapped, and sold. It was later abolished during the British Mandate, as the British saw it as a very primitive form of agriculture. And then under the Israeli occupation, in the West Bank, at least 60% of the lands are under Israeli military and civil control. It's known as Area C, and much of those lands are Masha. So we see now how Palestinian agriculture began bowing to powerful external market forces. Ilan Pape, in his book, A History of Modern Palestine, A Land, Two Peoples, says, the peasants were not just moving away from known modes of production or losing their traditional means of production, they were abandoning a way of life, a set of beliefs that had helped them make sense of their lives, but without a blueprint for the future. It was in these circumstances that nationalism became an attractive option, particularly the brand that had roots in spiritual, religious interpretation of reality. So this is an image from the Hula Valley, the Hula Lake, before it was drained. Sorry, I'm having an issue here. As a result of land becoming private property, around 1905, European ideas of landscape began to take root in the Zionist project of constructing garden cities in Palestine. Garden cities were inspired by English architect and planner Ebenezer Howard's Garden Cities of Tomorrow, a utopian city in harmony with nature, and German landscape architect and planner Lebrecht Mige's Green Manifesto, a progressive and sophisticated sustainable green urban planning scheme that never really took hold in Germany, but thrived under his disciples in Palestine. There we go. Garden cities became the urban planning inspiration for modern Israeli settlements. To these architects and urban planners, they were making use of untamed wilderness, civilizing it, and creating living conditions suitable for European immigrants. To Palestinians, the so-called wilderness, well, to indigenous Palestinian fallah, there were Palestinian cities at the time. I'm talking about Palestinian peasants. To the fallah, this so-called wilderness was a thriving ecosystem that was bountiful, often held in common ownership with rich customs and practices and stewardship of nature. For example, the Hula Lake was a key node in the migratory pattern of wildlife from Africa, Asia, and Europe, and served as a natural filtration system for water flowing into the Upper Jordan. Hula was one of the oldest freshwater lakes in the world and site to some of the earliest indigenous settlements. Sandy Sufyan, in Blind Modernism, explains the architectural methods of the indigenous inhabitants of the lake contrasted with Western capitalist imperatives of intensive agricultural cultivation and irrigation, in which natural commodities were seen only as resources. Rather than striving to conquer land, Sufyan explains, Arab farmers lacking capital-intensive technologies saw themselves as working with the land, within its constraints, and accepting its material limits. They did not depend on capital from abroad, as the settlers did. Instead, the peasants relied on naturally produced inputs. Sharecropping had its own logic, privileging communal economic security over immediate monetary rewards. In 1950, the Jewish National Fund announced its plans to drain the Hula Valley as part of a larger project to make productive use of water of the Jordan Basin. By 1958, the valley had been entirely drained, malaria-free, and suitable for garden city development. There was a thriving weaving community there, and in fact, studies were done to see if that could be monetized and capitalized, but in the end, it didn't pay off. Okay, so that's a little bit of the background. Now I'd like to talk about the faces of neoliberalism in Palestine today. And many of the works I'm going to show you were produced between 2013 and 14 for a solo show called Caravans, which was hosted at Darat al-Fannun in Amman, Jordan. This piece is an oil painting I made called Corrugated Landscape. So a bit of a context, that show featured 12 works relating to the rise of neoliberal politics, terraforming, and social engineering sweeping the West Bank today. Drawing on past and continuing efforts to turn the Bedouins of Palestine into an urban proletariat indebted to Israel, Caravans takes a critical look at indebtedness as a form of impoverishment and the mechanisms of its promotion used by the Palestinian Authority today. Precarity is nothing new to Palestinians. It's a foundational component of their modern experience, but bubble economics, consumer debt, and real estate speculation are the contemporary ingredients of that experience. So around 2012, everywhere you went in the West Bank, you would see one of these corrugated sheet metal billboards. The whole landscape was covered as if mushrooms had popped up overnight, and they were empty. So they were a blank slate on which to project your hopes and fears and desires. The material reality of the corrugated sheet metal, of course, refers to an invention of a British officer in Australia in the 1800s, as it was used to cheaply house inmates. It's also the material used to make shipping containers, which are notorious as hilltop settlement outposts. But I'll talk more about that later. This painting on the left-hand side shows a new Palestinian development. This one's called Rawabi. And on the right-hand side, there's a little tower in the background. It's not clear if it's an Israeli watchtower or a mosque minaret. And then flanked on either side of the billboard, you see there's six sheep here and 6 sheep there. And this is a very recognizable composition in Palestine. Obviously, it refers to the Last Supper, something that you would see in every storefront, in every shop. And the technique I used was reminiscent of the kind of paintings I was finding in my explorations of villages. Untrained artists would make landscape paintings, often very romantic and reminiscent of European landscapes, with a windmill in the foreground, for example. So that was the approach I have. And here the billboard is just precariously positioned too close to the road, as if a semi-tractor trailer or something knocked it on its corner. And it wasn't long before before the billboards got covered. And here's an example of one of those vinyl posters that I took from a billboard and I displayed in the gallery. All I did was add some spray paint to the face so that the boss here becomes a prophet of sorts. It's a worker asking the boss for a raise so that they can buy a house, and the boss is saying, why don't you go to the bank and take advantage of one of these new mortgages, these new loans, a new thing in Palestine at the time. And of course, the buildings have names that refer to cities in the Gulf states. So like a building called Riyadh, a building called Dubai, and that's very telling because that's what the liberation dream is. You can get a loan, you can get into debt and live in Dubai. This building is called Dream in Arabic. It's called Dream Number 1. And here you see some more posters and billboards of Rawabi. Rawabi is the newest, most sophisticated and expensive Palestinian city. Here's a master plan of Rawabi. And it's worth noting that it follows the topology of Israeli settlements. So when I first saw Rawabi, when I first saw this image, I immediately thought of teeth coming out of the landscape. Traditionally, Palestinians would store their wealth in livestock and gold that they would cap their teeth with. So I found two old Palestinian dentists, well, not that old, who still work in this method, and we made some gold teeth for a camel jaw. Rawabi in Arabic means two hilltops. So here we see a representation of those two hilltops. Sorry, this is some production photos, making molds, weighing how much gold we need to cover their teeth. In fact, this piece toured the Dentist Association in Palestine, which was one of the most important exhibitions I think I've ever been involved in. These two dentists were absolutely thrilled because they got to show off a craft that they hadn't used in so long. It brought a lot of attention to them, and the office was completely full of people every time we were working on the camel jaw. So here it is upside down. Rawabi means hilltops, so I turned it upside down. And it's flanked by images on either side of it. Here you can see these images on either side of it of caravans that were once settler Israeli caravans that were then sold to Palestinian construction sites to be used in the Palestinian construction industry. And so I bought one of these caravans, and I made a piece out of it called Jonah's Whale. It's a container I cut into 11 cross sections, hand slicing it through all the layers of gypsum, steel, insulation, wires, carpets, windows, and even a mattress where someone used to sleep. The title, Jonah's Whale, is derived from the biblical tale in which a whale devours the prophet Jonah for defaulting on a promise made to God. While in the belly of this great whale, Jonah pleads for forgiveness and vows to repay his divine debt. And eventually, after 3 days and nights, God commands the whale to spew Jonah out. My question is, how shall we escape from these pathological debts that hold claim on our lives, and who's going to give the command to spew us out? Jonah's Whale, the shipping container, which is colloquially referred to as a caravan in Palestine, references flows of global capital and debt, expansion and extraction, and architectures of occupation. Slicing the caravan sheds light upon itself and the landscape it's been instrumental in shaping. Here, distinctions of interior and exterior collapse as this transnational agent of globalization functions to frame the complex palimpsest of power and commerce that shapes the landscape well beyond the regional context. And here it is in St. Peter's Cathedral in Cologne for a show that was curated by Kai Cullens with generous support from Christian Zimmerman and the Carly Egebauer Gallery. So, following on the billboards, I had a compulsion to make one out of sheepskin. And that was a long process of tanning in my studio. Billboard number 2, Ya Ghanamati, O my sheep, the Arabic name, which is referencing a nursery rhyme, is emblematic of the mechanisms of commercial debt. So while Jonah Whale was referencing divine debt, Ya Ghanamati is referencing commercial debt. It's a full-sized, 6-meter-long mechanical tri-louvered billboard, partially surfaced with musty sheepskins pulled and squeezed between its rotating aluminum surfaces. Eventually, they disappear. But they always return. This piece is called Failing to Levant. So while Jonah's Whale was emblematic of divine debt and billboard number 2, Yahanamati, of commercial debt, Failing to Levant references debt to tradition. It's a mirage of pulleys, steel cable, stone tile, and a construction site chain hoist hanging from the gallery ceiling in a kind of impossible equilibrium. Levant is a geographic term that refers to the lands of the Eastern Mediterranean, originating from the Latin levare, to lift or raise. In English, Levant also means to flee one's debts. Both meanings intertwine here in this totem as a mirage, at once uplifting and mired in tradition. The tiles used in this work were sourced from a factory, the same factory in Nablus that made the original tiles in Amman, Jordan, as a matter of fact. Today, the factory, like many of Palestine's traditional crafts, is being threatened with closure due to political and economic restrictions and increased imports in China. I'm going to skip a few projects because I think I'm probably going too long. How are we doing? How much time do we have left?
25 minutes.
Okay. So this piece is called Treadmill. You can see it installed in Darat Fnun on one side. On the other side, this is the land of Abu Sayyah and Arakib in the Negev. This is a Bedouin community that's been expelled from their lands, and the Bedouins had never registered for leases for their lands through the Ottoman land law because they didn't believe that land could be owned. And so they've really felt the brunt of the problem. And they live now on a cemetery very close to a factory that builds billboards. So it's very, very telling. I think this should play, but let me hit play here. So here you see the treadmill covered in black goat skin. The Israelis have outlawed the black goat, grazing of the black goat, which is the livelihood of the Bedouin community for environmental reasons. And since then, there's been an increase in the number of wildfires. It was only, the black goat law actually was passed in the 50s. But last year it was repealed as the Israelis recognized the importance of the black goat in maintaining the landscape. Moshe Dayan in 1963 said, "We should transform the Bedouin into an urban proletariat in industry, services, construction, and agriculture. 88% of the Israeli population are not farmers. Let the Bedouin be like them. Indeed, this will be a radical move, which means that the Bedouin would not live on his land with his herds, but would become an urban person who comes home in the afternoon and puts his slippers on. His children will get used to a father who wears pants without a dagger and who does not pick their nits out in public. They will go to school, their hair combed and parted. This will be a revolution. But it can be achieved in 2 generations, without coercion, but with government direction. This phenomena of the Bedouins will disappear." Okay, so genealogy of the liberation dream in Palestine. In the first part of the, during the first Intifada, the liberation movement made posters that looked like this one on the right. These are both artworks by Abdurrahman al-Muzayyan. He was one of the chief artists of the PLO, right-hand man of Yasser Arafat, in fact. And his influence was Canaanite. So the liberation movement instrumentalized the Fallah to a large extent and portrayed the dream as one that was embodied with nature. One where resistance was deeply rooted in the landscape. But today, the liberation dream looks like this advertisement. Here you see a young man spray painting on the wall, the Israeli separation wall. I am free is the slogan. This is an advertisement of Jawal, Palestine's largest telecom company. And I am free here refers to being able to buy a telephone. Behind that logo, you can see Pray for Palestine. I think that's very telling. The identity of the local is replaced by a universal one. I have a cell phone, therefore I'm free. So if you have a cell phone and a mortgage, you're less likely to participate in collective action. So what are the possibilities of emancipatory action under these kind of conditions? In search of an antidote to the neoliberal, alienating, consumerist culture, and given increasing numbers of disenfranchised youth in our refugee camps and rural areas, Sahar Kouasmi and I established Sakia Art, Science, Agriculture in the village of Ankinia. Sakia is a progressive academy, a residency program, a research hub, and a farm located in Ankinia, just 7 kilometers west of Ramallah. By grafting local agrarian traditions of self-sufficiency with contemporary art and ecological practices, we seek to create new narratives around our relationship to land, knowledge production, and the commons. Sakia brings together cultural practitioners, farmers, scientists, academics, community elders, women, and children together to share knowledge, stories, and technical know-how. Through collaborative exchange and celebration, we are constantly exploring what it means to reclaim our heritage and cultivate possible futures for Sakia. Sakia has a number of outstanding natural resources. This is one of 2 holy trees on our site. It's a red madrone, or arbutas and drachne in Arabic. It's the holy cacao tree, and it's built atop the shrine of Abu al-Ainain. And this is you can't see it very well, it's the oldest oak tree in Palestine. At Sakia, we have more than 400 goats and Bedouins passing through on a daily basis. I'll just take you through the landscape and some of the programs we have. This was the house before we began renovation, with almond trees growing out of it. And the Holy Spring in the foreground here, which we repaired with the help of the village and a number of volunteers and programs that we set up. And here you can see us celebrating one of those great moments on a hot summer day. So Sakia engages with a number of counter-hegemonic notions of education and security, environmental security, food security, as well as counter-hegemonic notions of sustainability that reject the supposition that sustainability can be solved with technology alone. At Sakia, we're under occupation. We're operating in Area C with all the restrictions that entails. And that means there's no heavy machinery. All of this work is done by hand. Here we're engaging in reviving traditional methods with Birzeit students and interns, traditional building methods. We have a number of programs that fall under what we call rewilding pedagogy, including a Garden is Our Classroom project. This is a group of Harvard and MIT students from ACT learning about the politics of ecology and rewilding from Professor Omar Tezdel in the center there. Permaculture programs are a big part of our work and draw a lot of local farmers as well as young people from around Palestine. We collect beledi seeds, beledi, that's heirloom seeds that don't require very much water, preserve them. And we have a number of symposia, lecture series, and workshops that support local trades and craftsmen, a stone workshop, an exhibition by Jumana Abila Boud about the work she did on site exploring traditional Palestinian spirits. And here's an open call on infrastructures as art. Exhibitions around wild plants, collaborative painting with young children in our summer program. This is one of our symposia, Under the Tree, Taxonomy, Empire, and Reclaiming the Commons. This is the poster is of a wakwak tree from the Book of Curiosities and Sciences from the 12th century. I really like this image because it offers an alternative creation myth where people are born from trees. And of course, we used Abdurrahman's Land Day poster for our instructional leaflet on composting. Our first exhibition featuring the work of Sakiya Halabi was called Between the Kaikab and the Balut. And she made all of the paintings from pigments and earth collected from the site. We have a few products that we sell to generate income, including these crayons made from all the different soils on site. And their names are derived from the location where the soil was collected. Here we have students from Birzeit University working in tandem with students from MIT on developing different types of architectural iterations of zir pots. And here we see a zir pot stack that's both cooling but functions as a periscope. So when you look through it, you get a waft of cool air. And this is the work of Nadia Asfour, who came to our site and researched the Palestinian spirit world as documented by the physician Tawfiq Kanaan in 1915. So he was working at the same time as Isa al-Isa and Menashe Mirovich, but he was collecting Palestinian amulets and talismans in exchange for medical treatments. And this collection is in the Birzeit Museum. And Nadia used these, the spirit world that Tawfiq Kanaan described as a tool for creating a deck of tarot cards in order to perhaps prompt our imaginations and inspire new ways of stories. And this is a work that was also collaboratively developed in our class that is a metabolic toilet. So it uses a Geneva mechanism. It's a 360-degree earth closet in the center of the room so that you really get a sense of your connection to nature every morning. Other artists that are invited to the program, such as Byron Kalomas here, are engaged with creating tools or playful experiences for the children during our summer school program. And this is an example of one of those. It's an exercise machine. It takes its cues a little bit from Islamic geometry. And the only way it works is if there are two people on it. So you have to raise the weight of the other person. So we're really trying to make people work together in different ways here. This is one slide of a very interesting project, and it's something we started at the outset of Sakia, which was creating a master plan with the village. Takhayali, which is the feminine for imagine, is the name of this project, and it was launched by in collaboration with Urbana by Natasha Aruri and Sakia, with Sahar Kawasmi and May Batta. And this involves working with women of the community, about 20 of them, and it's been a years-long process of interviewing them, getting a sense of their aspirations, their dreams, their desires for Sakia, with extensive interviews, and then working in collaboration with artists to interpret that vision. Here you can see Sakia, the K-cup tree I had mentioned earlier. The village of Ankinia would occupy this part. But this is, again, it's a very long process because that idea of modernity and that neoliberal dream is very deeply embedded. People still want a shopping mall, for example, or still kind of aspire to have luxuries that are destructive, not necessarily in harmony with the nature. So this is the first stage of that process of developing this master plan, and we will continue to work towards that end. This is a very special project that was initiated by the muallimeen, or the learned ones, the masters that work with us at Sakia, namely Yusuf Yaqub, and they decided they needed a place to be generous, a place to host. So they built this theater called Barfilia Theater. Barfilia references the town that they were exiled from. And since then, it's been used. This is Ramadan celebration, just a couple of days ago. And it gives the village a different type of economy, a different way of exchanging, and a great deal of pride in being able to regain that kind of role of being host. So I'm very proud of this project at Sakia. Okay, well, we can end there. So we're okay on time. Because I'm embarrassed.
Great.
A lot of my slides just disappeared. I didn't get to show you all the food and the produce. And the kitchen. The kitchen is a big part of Sakia.
Yes. Thank you, Nida. It's for this fantastic lecture, and it's always so amazing to see the precision of your work and all the research that goes into it. You started us off with the project Ka, which notably was recently featured on the cover of the Art Forum magazine. And it is a project that proposes a kind of hope to heal the rift between culture and nature. And then you brought us to wrap up at the end with a project with Sakia Works. And I wanted to kind of go back into this promise. It is an infrastructure to provide that healing, right? As I understand what Sakia is doing, and it's kind of broader picture. How do you measure the success of that collective effort? It's a bit unfair question to artists, but it's what makes it also really interesting because you are operating not only in the sphere of art. You work with people on the land. You work with NGOs. You work with funding agencies. You have to kind of prove that success, right? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's one that we're always kind of confronting ourselves with, right? Ultimately, Sakia would be successful if it's a model that's copied, and it would be successful if Sahar and I didn't have to work at it anymore, if it was completely taken over by the village and it had a life of its own. Yeah. I think that ultimately would be its success. But and it's a very difficult project. It was very, very difficult to kind of convince people that what we're doing made sense. Mm-hmm. I mean, there was always a lot of criticism. We spent so much time building dry stack stone walls without any mortar because we believe this is very important ecologically. Mm-hmm. They function as heat sinks. There's a lot of tradition and craft behind it. And people would come by and be like, well, I work in Israel in the construction business. I could do this in 2 days with cement. Why are you spending 2 months? And next year you're going to have to...
With all the machines.
Yeah, you're going to have to redo it, Yeah. So being able to convince people there's a value in kind of collective work and maintaining it is a big challenge. Of course, those traditions have eroded, right? The social fabric has disintegrated. People don't farm the way they used to. More than 130,000 workers work in the trades in Israel today who used to be farmers or come from an agrarian background. And in one generation, you lose all of that know-how that your grandparents used to have.
Yeah.
So bringing that back and giving it value is a very important part. And
but
when
without
it gets,
some kind of nostalgia, I mean, how do you make that? Without a nostalgia or kind of nationalist tone, how do you do that?
well, it's through education and through kind of exploring the artistic and aesthetic potential of it, and you'd be surprised it kind of takes care of itself. Now there's a lot of pride in kind of the crafts that have been revived, namely around stonework. There's a system that we put in place of a mentorship. So there's a lot of young people who I think would otherwise be very disenfranchised and rudderless, who are now very, very proud to have mastered the skill. And people from Ramallah come and see their work and then say, hey, can you come and do my backyard kind of thing. I think there's a lot of value to it. And
Great. I forgot to mention to our audiences online, you can post your questions while we are chatting and discussing. You can post your questions in the chat, and we will be reading them out loud here and asking Nida. And also here in the audience, please submit your questions, and the students will be collecting them and asking. We will have a microphone here where you can come and ask your question. I have two more questions before we give a voice to the audience here in the room and online. You spoke a lot about debt. So you started with the debt to nature, the divine debt, there was the commercial debt to tradition. Could you talk a little bit about the challenges of negotiating your debt in needing to fundraise for all of this work? And I mean, your own artwork, but also, I mean, how do you fund Sakia? And what does that entail in terms of, a kind of debt that it might create for the...
Yeah. No, that's a really good question, especially within the context of, the NGOization of Palestine.
Yeah.
The wealth of the country is not reflected in the GDP. And there's a culture of kind of dependence on foreign aid that we're really very wary of. And that's another answer to how do you measure the success of it. It's like if we didn't need any external funding, that would be a success. But we do take it wherever we can, whenever we can, because our motto almost is by any means necessary. We have to get it to a certain point. So we're kind of, in that sense, we are, parasitic to a degree, and we have received external funding. But the expense of renovating these 900-year-old plus buildings is quite laborious and time-consuming. Everything is done by donkey. So being able to transition into more sustenance economy would be ultimately our goal, where people from the village take over the farmlands and exploit the kitchen that we're building and take advantage of the hundreds of people from Ramallah that come to Sakia over the weekends to picnic. And that could be a rotating, a sharecropping kind of system where families share that hosting responsibility. And if that was to happen, I think the project would take care of itself, and I think we're close to it.
I hope so. Could you talk a little bit about opportunities and challenges of, you being here at MIT as a professor, but then also having this practice and whole institution there? How do you bridge these two worlds? You showed us images of students traveling Palestine. Have there been people traveling here? I mean, how do you bring also these experiences to MIT? into your classes, and how can kind of this context learn from that context? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Right. Well, all too often, the epicenter of climate change is happening in places that are very far removed from the institutions that are exploring it, and there's a wealth of knowledge to be learned from the Levant, from Canaanite drought strategies, to Natufian cultural systems of sharecropping and semi-sedentary farming practices. And so I have a class here, Common Ground, Art, Science, Agriculture, where, when you saw students from MIT at Sakia, that was the first year we did that, and we were able to send students over spring break. And they made some amazing projects and brought them back. And this class really does try to explore the broader history around the rift between culture and nature, art and agriculture, by looking into some anarchist anthropologists like David Graeber and James Scott, and feminists like Silvia Federici, among many others. And I think it can be very mutually beneficial and mutually enriching, but that's not to say it isn't a challenge. It's incredible.
We need a farm.
We need a farm here at. We need a Sakia MIT. That's my hope. I'm looking at you there.
Yes. Thank you so much, Nida. So let's open it up for questions from the audience here and online. Anyone?
But let me just say that there are some really, on the idea of having that kind of initiative here. I have to mention that there are some amazing projects like Sakia happening all over the world that we take a lot of strength and support from. And here I'd like to give a shout out to Common Good Co-op in Dorchester, run by Kathy Dixon. And we've had a great exchange around Sakia and her project. Also Soulfire Farms in upstate New York. Very amazing local projects engaging with indigenous agrarian traditions and kind of bringing them into dialogue with contemporary practices. Sorry, go ahead.
On that note, I also want to give shout out to Cooking Sections, which was nominated for the Turner Prize and then nominated Sakia as to give you the award, so to say.
Yeah,
right?
they dedicated the award to Sakia, which is one collective to another.
I just really think it's such a beautiful gesture of solidarity and collaboration that is also evolving in the art world through that. I think we were all just so thrilled about that move, which is very unusual in the kind of egotistical world of the arts. So.
Yeah, it was the first year also that all the nominees were collectives, and I think it's a development in kind of the social art practice, the history of social art practice. Yeah.
Queenie, you have some questions for us? Okay.
So thank you, Nida, for the sharing. Thank you, Asa, for the questions. I want to share a story because I've been working with Nida for a while. So last year, there are moments that it has been quite like a lot of tensions at Palestine. And, we students are very sensitive and we don't want to bother Nida. So we were trying to avoid sending him questions or emails unnecessarily, approving of our registration and stuff. We were like, oh my God, what's looking at the news, we just don't want to bother him. But then he replied an email and he was like, oh, as miserable times, education is what keeps me on, keep me moving on. And I think this is a very moving statement and I always keep it in my mind. Just want to ask you to share with us your teaching philosophy, because it's how Atra introduced you to not only just an artist, you're an educator. So tell us more about that.
Well, thank you. Well, I don't know how to summarize this, but look, I'm very curious, and I always like to learn. And I guess my philosophy is to just maximize the potential of creating a dialogue and opportunities to learn collectively with our students. So yeah, that's I mean, I can get into the nitty-gritty of the kind of the strategies and the type of prompts that I like to use, but I think that's...
Where I come from, Sakia means the one who pours the wine. What's the meaning? Is it the same?
Well, look, Sakia, it's a great word. It references the stem of a mushroom, a sharecropping contract, one who waters, and the person, the waters plants, but one who also waters the imagination at a poetry reading or a halaka, a round circle. So in that sense, yes, it also refers to the person that pours wine at one of these poetry gatherings.
I think it's, we all share this about your classes, like you're such power of nature, like when you start talking to it, I'm so sorry you read this lecture, I wish you just like talk it like as you do on your classes. Yeah, I mean,
That's very good criticism. Feedback taken to heart. Touche, yeah.
I also have a question for Nida. As somebody who's also taking your agriculture class this semester, I think this is something for me that's very fascinating, that like comes a lot in your work, and I think it also comes a lot in the classroom, and it's these notions of mythology and the importance of mythology. So something I had written down from Ka, and how Ka questions us what future we're building. My question would be, what futures do you think can we build, and what's the role of mythology in this process?
Yeah, that's it's a great question. I think it's a question of understanding it as an infrastructure. I think mythologies can serve that purpose. They can assuage our fears and mitigate our anxieties and create a relationship to land. But that relationship, I think, can't be a contractual one, right? It can't operate on that level. It needs to be something that operates on a different kind of economy, on a moral economy, for example. And I think mythology can serve that purpose. I think it can become a witness in a way that's not authoritarian, and in that sense, I think it has a lot of potential to really inspire our imaginations. That's like one of the projects in our class we're doing around rethinking scarecrows in terms of the mythologies that govern the natural resource at Sakia. And this is something that Sheila Kennedy and I have been discussing and have some plans to collaborate around. And as you know, that idea, and for those of you who don't know, is that we would like to rethink the scarecrow as a host, not something that makes you afraid, but rather something that can both be welcoming and at the same time begging for patience. So wild boar, for example, the number one problem for Palestinian farmers, especially in Area C, where you're not allowed to build fences, are the wild boar. And it also keeps women off of the farm, which is something we're trying to change. Imagine a scarecrow that could sense a boar, play a barking dog sound when the harvest is ready to be reaped, but at the end of that, welcomes the boar to till the soil. The same with birds. When the seedlings are small, it might play the sound of a hawk. When the plants are big, it might welcome them to eat the insects, for example. So it's a host and it's sharing, and that kind of hybrid personality, kind of like it's this and that, is very much kind of in keeping with the way these spirits or the jinn are described. They're hybrid and queer characters. But I think the challenge in designing this is engaging in a collaborative process of design that that really does, frees the imagination from any of the kind of anthropomorphic or assumptions you might bring to what a scarecrow looks like. So at Sakia, we're really thinking about what do they sound like, and can sound determine the form, and can the stories determine the form of these kind of things. So, and then the other part of that is like a lot of these mythologies are disappearing, so we have to always try to reinvent and come up with new ones.
Great, thank you so much. I have a couple of questions that came in through the online audience. And so the first one asks, in reference to the advertisement of the spray-painted border wall, how do artists reclaim an emancipatory aesthetic, potentially?
An emancipatory
Aesthetic.
In reference to the wall.
In reference to the telecom advertisement, I believe.
Well, I think, I think any kind of aesthetic that disappears is emancipatory. I don't know exactly how to refer it back to that wall, but any kind of activity, that is really engaged in the act of giving, in that gesture, whatever form it takes, if it's coming from that place of gifting, I think that's a powerful, it's emancipatory, and it's a revolutionary way to approach practice.
We have one more question from online, then we can open to the floor here. High-value agriculture seems to offer significant economic growth for Palestine. What's the best way to engage with Palestinian agriculture to identify binding constraints? Or what's the best practice in engaging Palestinian farmers?
What's the best practice of engaging Palestinian farmers?
And agriculture sectors.
Yeah, look, I mean, Israel controls agriculture in Palestine. So, much of the most fertile land around the Jordan River Valley Basin, and in the west, where the wall has been built, all of that land is on the Israeli side of the wall. So Palestinian agriculture has really been decimated. It's in a terrible shape. And the Palestinian Authority doesn't subsidize it. So Palestinian farmers have a very difficult time being competitive in the market. And it's very hard to convince people to farm because they could buy produce, Israeli produce, for pennies on the dollar. So that's why you have to kind of create celebration, a different economy, a moral economy around and value around these kind of heritage practices. There's amazing initiatives in Palestine that are operating. The Agricultural Workers Union collecting indigenous seeds and creating a seed bank. But they've recently been put on the terrorist watch list with a number of civil society organizations by the Israelis. So it's a very, very, very dire situation. And what's happening is a lot of young people are setting up small-scale agricultural initiatives that are completely organic, that have like farm-to-doorbell service, and that's been successful. So another shout out to Yara Douani and her farm project in Bil'in.
Anyone has any questions? Feel free to the mic stand. Oh yeah, or raise your hand and we can pass the mic.
Nida, I just wanted to ask you kind of on something you have expressed in the past and maybe you can expand on that. Like when you were talking about the fabricators who came to your opening, and also the dentists who got to showcase their work in the museum. And I'm kind of curious about, you also talk about how to take the museum into the farm and the farm into the museum. And I'm kind of curious about where you see art playing a role in engaging communities that are oftentimes not associated with art or do not think they can enter the art world. How do you engage those communities, and a little more perspective on that?
Well, I think, yeah, like that's a great question. Yusuf Yaqub, one of our masters or muallim, has been collaborating with the artists on site, the artists that come to Sakia, and just creating the space for that to happen is incredibly important. One of our students created a piece that he just recently installed, and it inspired the way he approached building the theater that I showed you, and wants to put little, glass mortar within the cracks of the walls to catch the sun and create a solar calendar. And this came out of working, with the students from MIT and with myself and other artists in the area. I think, it can happen on multiple registers, but I think it's also important to think, when we're talking about art and what is art and, what isn't art, that, these agrarian or heritage practices kind of have a space to enter into the avant-garde. And I think, that's the kind of thing that we see happening with a number of artists that are deeply invested in ecology and agriculture. How long it lasts, how deeply embedded it is in a community is another aspect. And sometimes, if it's really successful, it becomes every day. And then it's not art, it's life, And maybe that also answers this question of this, what's the aesthetic regime? I'm not sure I understood that, but when it disappears and when it becomes part of the fabric of your daily life, and it's enriching people, and giving them pride, then I don't know what else to ask for.
Nida, I only caught the last half hour. So sorry I missed everything before that, but I'm hearing shout outs to work that I know and love. My question is, you're embedded in an engineering institute, and I know you have a certain ambivalent relationship to engineering.
Ambivalent.
Yeah. So I'm wondering if you could change the engineering paradigm in the way that you're addressing the agricultural logic, the agri-logistics. I'm so fascinated by the engineering of these social relationships and these traditional crafts and these, right? There's a lot of thoughtful social engineering in the social practice art and the social sculpture. So I'm just curious as to, could you codify that and make us all human microphones as we move around MIT?
Wow. Caroline Jones. That is fantastic. I think, my father's an engineer. I grew up with a little bit of an engineering background. My mother's side of the family are artists. And so I've always kind of found myself in between that. I think being open is one thing. To experience different possibilities is something that I find to be a rewarding challenge when I have engineering students in some of our classes. Engaging in a process of iteration where the materials and the environment and the conditions inform the work. You start with your hands and the kind of the material logic, rather than bringing an idea of what you would like, a drawing, and then forcing, whatever nature or material to shape. So, and I think, when I was talking about the hula, how the farmers in the Hula Lake, without external funding and the kind of intensive agricultural machinery and infrastructure, kind of worked in relationship with the materials they had, and that is the foundation of how they listen to the landscape and a certain mode of existence with it. I think it's very easy for an engineer to see a problem and say, okay, I can fix that by making this, that, or the other, without taking a step back and looking at the larger issue. And that's why I think sustainable technologies are not the solution if we can't change kind of all the stories and mythologies around it. You can't solve the climate issue without solving the colonial issue, without solving the capitalist issue, without solving that relationship, that story and that relationship to nature. So that's on the one hand, right? And on the other, I would give the microphone to all the women on campus and let their voices ring. I think the foundation of the collective Masha system in Palestine was a matrilateral one, and that's something I would very much like to see come back into practice. How it was engineered, no one really knows. I'm still looking into it. It's very nuanced, and sometimes it gets down to like how far your voice can carry is how far that land and who runs that land, and et cetera. Very, very subtle relationships that are very particular to a valley or a plain or a mountaintop. And but I think there's a lot of wisdom in learning from those practices. And I'm going to try to bring some of that back, and I'm going to think further on your question, Caroline. Thank you.
So there's another question online from my brother, who's just texted the question to me, which I think is also pertinent to what you just said. So he's asking, his question to you would be, what is the role of the woman today within this contemporary agricultural collaboration?
That's a great that's a great question. Of course, well, maybe I'll answer it with a story. So, we were with a friend, and she was telling us a story about 30 years ago. Her village would have these seasonal solstice celebrations, where all the women in the village would put their clothes on inside out and walk backwards up a hill carrying offerings to the holy shrine, and roosters, and then all the other women would come out of the windows and throw rice at them and sing all of these songs. And they've been doing this for God knows how long. Until about 25, 30 years ago, the men would come out of the mosque and ridicule them and be like, this isn't going to do anything. That's not going to bring rain. Only God and prayer. And the women were like, well, what do you know? It's been raining. It's been raining every year. So what do you know? And unfortunately, those kind of practices have died out. And it's a function of kind of, I think, a lot of different factors. Alienation, disenfranchisement. You see this happening. Kind of the result being that people become more easily radicalized. And it's women and children that take the brunt of that. All the bad effects of that. Now that said, you can't make any generalized statements. Obviously, some of the the most powerful, impressive, and inspirational people in Palestine are women, like my partner Sahra Kawasmi, who's able to negotiate any situation, in a village or in a rural countryside with belligerent groups across the political divide, And she's been an inspiration to, I think, all the women and children, especially the young women in Kenya as well. But yeah.
This is a beautiful final note, I would say. I would like to leave it on this inspiring voice of the women in the space. And thank you all very much for being with us tonight. Thank you, Nida, for sharing your amazing work with us. And big thanks for the department, to the Department of Architecture, Nicolas de Monchot, the department head, for hosting us here and supporting this lecture series and hosting ACT within the departmental lecture series. Thank you, and see you in our next event here online and here in person. Bye-bye.
Thank you.